Under the endless desert sky of southern New Mexico, where heat shimmered like a living veil over the sand and the mountains stood like silent witnesses to secrets older than memory, Holloman Air Force Base had long been a place where the boundary between the possible and the impossible seemed thinner than anywhere else on Earth. And on a night in late October, when the wind dragged thin ribbons of dust across the tarmac and the stars burned with a strange, unwavering intensity, Senior Airman Daniel Reyes was finishing the most uneventful shift of his young career as a radar technician when the screen before him flickered with a return so violent, so sudden, that for a fraction of a second he assumed the system had glitched. The object had appeared without warning at the far edge of the array's range, moving at a velocity that defied every rule he had studied, accelerating from a dead stop to over 20,000 miles per hour in less than a heartbeat, then stopping just as abruptly, hovering in absolute defiance of inertia roughly 80,000 feet above the restricted airspace that bordered White Sands missile range. And Daniel, whose father had once told him that the desert kept its own counsel, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night as he recalibrated the scope, checked for atmospheric distortion, and ran a diagnostic that returned nothing but green across the board. While beside him, Technical Sergeant Mara Collins leaned over, her sharp eyes narrowing as she watched the return dance across the screen in jagged, impossible angles that suggested not a mechanical craft, but something almost playful, as if the sky itself were testing the limits of their comprehension. Within minutes, the command center filled with tension, officers whispering into secure lines, supervisors demanding confirmation, and somewhere deep within the base, a protocol long buried under layers of classification stirred back to life. Because this was not the first time Holloman's radar had tracked something that moved like a thought instead of machine, and as the object shot straight up, vanishing from the atmosphere only to reappear 30 miles east without traversing the space between, Daniel understood that whatever they were watching did not obey the physics that governed. Missiles, or aircraft, or even experimental hypersonic prototypes rumored to exist in hangars so secret that even whispers avoided them. And when the base commander, Colonel Everett Shaw, entered the control room with a face carved from controlled alarm, he did not ask whether the reading was real, but instead asked a single question: is it back? As though he had been expecting this exact moment for years. The object blinked out again, leaving only silence and a low hum of electronics. Yet the air in the room remained charged, and Daniel noticed that Sergeant Collins' hands trembled slightly before she folded them behind her back, while outside the desert wind rose in a sudden gust that rattled the glass like distant applause. And over the next hour, the base shifted into a posture that no public manual would ever describe: aircraft. Grounded, communications routed through encrypted channels. A small convoy dispatched toward an isolated section of range where, according to triangulated data, the object had briefly descended to within 5,000 feet of the Earth before accelerating beyond measurable limits. Daniel, against all expectation, was ordered to accompany the convoy as technical verification. And as the vehicles rolled out into the black expanse beyond the base perimeter, headlights carving tunnels through the dust, he felt the weight of history pressing in from all sides, for Holloman had once tested rockets that pierced the edge of space and trained primates who would be the first living beings to ride flames into the unknown. And yet none of those feats seemed to compare with what they had just witnessed on a radar screen that now displayed nothing but empty sky. The convoy drove in tense silence until they reached a stretch of desert marked only by a cluster of scrub and a faint metallic tang in the air, as though lightning had struck without a storm. And there, half buried in the sand, they found a circular depression fused into glass. The silica melted into a smooth basin that reflected the moon like a dark mirror, and at its center lay an object no larger than a football, perfectly spherical, its surface shifting with a subtle iridescence that made it impossible to fix its color, while instruments in the vehicles began to malfunction one by one, radios dissolving into static, GPS units freezing, and Daniel's portable scanner cycling through error messages that made no sense. Colonel Shaw ordered a perimeter established, his voice calm, but edged with something older than fear, and as scientists from a sealed hangar team arrived in unmarked suits, Daniel felt a strange pull toward the sphere, as if it recognized the pattern of his thoughts and responded with a low hum that vibrated not in the air, but inside his skull. And when he took an involuntary step closer, Sergeant Collins grabbed his arm with surprising force, whispering that this was exactly how the last incident had begun 12 years earlier, though she refused to elaborate. And before he could press her, the sphere emitted a pulse of light that expanded outward in a silent wave, knocking several men to their knees and causing the desert itself to shimmer like water disturbed by a stone. And for a brief, impossible instant, Daniel saw something overlaying the landscape. Structures not built by human hands, towers of impossible geometry rising seemed absurdly primitive, while Colonel Shaw's voice cracked through the calm, ordering no one to fire under any circumstances, as if some fragile negotiation were underway that none of them fully understood. And Daniel realized with a jolt that the radar event had not been a malfunction or an intrusion, but a signal, a deliberate act of being seen, tracked, measured, as though whatever intelligence guided the sphere wanted Holloman specifically to notice. And in that moment, the years of secret tests, classified projects, and whispered rumors converged into a single terrifying possibility. The base had not merely detected the impossible, it had been chosen by it. The sphere drifted toward Daniel, ignoring every other presence, and though he tried to step back, his feet felt rooted to the sand, while a cascade of images flooded his mind. Ancient deserts under alien constellations, oceans boiling into atmosphere, civilizations rising and collapsing in the span of breaths, and a voice not heard but understood formed a single question that echoed through his consciousness. "Are you ready?" And Daniel, overwhelmed yet unable to look away, sensed that the question was not meant for him alone, but for the species he represented, for the fragile network of satellites and radars and weapons that stitched Earth into a wary web. And before he could form any answer, the sky itself seemed to fracture as multiple returns exploded across the base's distant radar arrays, dozens of objects entering the atmosphere in perfect synchronization, moving at those same impossible speeds, converging not in hostility, but in what felt like inevitability. And far behind them at Holloman, alarms began to wail as operators watched their screens fill with trajectories that defied mathematics. While in the desert, the sphere's glow intensified, casting long shadows that twisted like living things across the sand, and Colonel Shaw shouted orders that were swallowed by a rising hum that resonated through bone and stone alike. And Daniel understood with a clarity that bordered on terror that the first tracking had been only a test, a knock at the door of a world that had finally learned to look up, and now the door. As the hum swelled into a vibration that seemed to unmake the silence of the desert itself, Daniel felt the sand beneath his boots liquefy into trembling grains while the hovering sphere flared brighter than the moon. And above them, the sky over Holloman fractured into streaks of white fire as the incoming objects decelerated in perfect defiance of inertia, halting without shockwaves or sonic booms, as though the laws of motion were polite suggestions rather than binding truths. And in the command center miles away, technicians stared in disbelief as radar returns stacked atop one another in geometries that no flight path algorithm could reconcile, the screens painting a three-dimensional lattice of movement that suggested coordination beyond any human squadron. Colonel Shaw's voice cut through the rising panic with a command to stand down all weapon systems, his authority rooted not merely in rank, but in a knowledge he had guarded for years, because 12 years earlier, on a night eerily similar to this one, a lone object had performed the same impossible maneuvers and had left behind not destruction, but a message encoded in electromagnetic noise that only a handful of physicists had ever deciphered, a message that translated not into words, but into mathematical constants subtly altered, as if reality itself had been annotated, and Shaw had been a young major. Then, sworn into a compartmentalized program that acknowledged a truth too destabilizing for public discourse. Humanity was being observed not continuously, but periodically, examined at intervals marked by leaps in technological awareness. And radar, our primitive extension of sight into the sky, had finally become sophisticated enough to be answered. In the desert, the sphere rotated slowly before Daniel, its surface rippling like liquid metal responding to unseen tides, and the voice within his mind returned, no longer a single question, but a cascade of impressions that bypassed language. Images of early humans striking stone against stone, of the first rockets clawing toward orbit, of satellites forming a glittering web around the planet, and then of Holloman's radar dish turning its patient gaze outward, each image threaded with a sense of evaluation, as though a cosmic threshold had been reached. And Daniel realized with a mixture of awe and dread that the impossible speeds they had tracked were not demonstrations of power, but calibrations, measurements of how their detection systems perceived movement. Because to these visitors motion was not distance over time, but position over intention, and what appeared to be instantaneous acceleration was simply the shortest path through dimensions humanity barely suspected. Sergeant Collins, recovering from the pulse that had knocked her to one knee, shouted that the perimeter teams were reporting multiple luminous forms descending across the range without touching ground, each one projecting the same harmonic resonance, now vibrating in Daniel's skull. And when he tore his gaze from the sphere long enough to glance upward, he saw them. Dozens of lights arranged in a silent constellation just above the atmosphere, holding formation with serene precision, not advancing towards cities or military installations, but aligning over the desert as though honoring some ancient agreement with the emptiness. Back at the base, data streams overflowed as instruments designed to measure speed, altitude, and thermal signature failed to assign coherent values, and civilian satellites began to pick up anomalies that would soon ignite speculation across the globe. Yet for now, the event remained cloaked within layers of military control. A secret expanding faster than rumor could chase it. While Colonel Shaw stepped closer to Daniel, and the sphere despite every instinct urging caution, his eyes reflecting its glow as he spoke softly, not to his men, but to the hovering intelligence, stating coordinates and dates in a sequence that Daniel did not understand until the sphere responded by projecting a lattice of light between them. A three-dimensional map of Earth shimmering in midair, overlaid with points marking moments in history, where the impossible had brushed against the possible. Ancient sightings misinterpreted as omens, unexplained aerial phenomena dismissed as illusions, each one coinciding with technological inflection points, suggesting a pattern of cautious engagement rather than invasion. The voice within Daniel clarified, without words, that intervention had never been the intent. Only observation and eventual introduction, once a species developed the capacity to detect and question beyond myth and the radar. Tracking at impossible speed had been the final proof that humanity could perceive without panic, measure without immediate aggression. And though the perimeter bristled with armed personnel, none had fired, fulfilling a test they did not know they were taking. Yet not all reactions were so measured, because within secure bunkers elsewhere in the world, early warning systems were registering anomalies and leaders were demanding answers. And the fragile equilibrium of geopolitics trembled on the brink of, with serene precision, not advancing towards cities or military installations, but aligning over the desert as though honoring some ancient agreement with the emptiness. Back at the base, data streams overflowed as instruments designed to measure speed, altitude, and thermal signature failed to assign coherent values, and civilian satellites began to pick up anomalies that would soon ignite speculation across the globe. Yet for now, the event remained cloaked within layers of military control. A secret expanding faster than rumor could chase it. While Colonel Shaw stepped closer to Daniel, and the sphere despite every instinct urging caution, his eyes reflecting its glow as he spoke softly, not to his men, but to the hovering intelligence, stating coordinates and dates in a sequence that Daniel did not understand until the sphere responded by projecting a lattice of light between them. A three-dimensional map of Earth shimmering in midair, overlaid with points marking moments in history, where the impossible had brushed against the possible. ancient sightings misinterpreted as omens, unexplained aerial phenomena dismissed as illusions, each one coinciding with technological inflection points, suggesting a pattern of cautious engagement rather than invasion. The voice within Daniel clarified, without words, that intervention had never been the intent. Only observation and eventual introduction, once a species developed the capacity to detect and question beyond myth and the radar. Tracking at impossible speed had been the final proof that humanity could perceive without panic, measure without immediate aggression. And though the perimeter bristled with armed personnel, none had fired, fulfilling a test they did not know they were taking. Yet not all reactions were so measured, because within secure bunkers elsewhere in the world, early warning systems were registering anomalies and leaders were demanding answers. And the fragile equilibrium of geopolitics trembled on the brink of. Sphere seemed acutely aware of as it intensified the projection, shifting from Earth to a broader stellar neighborhood where faint lines connected stars like nodes in a vast, patient network, implying that intelligence was neither rare nor reckless, but organized into a tapestry of watchers bound by restraint. Daniel felt the enormity of it press against his mind. The idea that civilizations could reach maturity not by conquest, but by surviving their own volatility, and he sensed a pivotal choice, forming not in any single command center, but within collective human behavior over the next fragile hours. Because the visitors would not override free will or disable arsenals, they would simply remain visible, unmistakable and undeniable, forcing humanity to confront the question of whether fear would dictate response. Colonel Shaw, understanding perhaps more than he could ever explain, ordered an open broadcast on emergency frequencies stating only that unidentified aerial phenomena were present but non-hostile and that no engagement was authorized, a statement that would ripple through military channels worldwide, buying precious minutes of restraint. And as those minutes stretched, the luminous forms above the desert descended just enough to be seen from nearby towns, appearing as brilliant, motionless stars arranged in deliberate symmetry, sparking awe rather than immediate terror among civilians who stepped outside to stare upward, phones raised in trembling hands. In the desert basin, the sphere drifted closer to Daniel until it hovered inches from his forehead, and in a final surge of communion, it transmitted not technology or weaponry, but understanding, a glimpse of physics where space folded like fabric, of energy drawn not from combustion, but from the structure of vacuum itself. Knowledge offered not as a gift to be seized, but as a horizon to be approached gradually. And with it came a warning woven in quiet gravity. Civilizations that leapt without cohesion often fractured under the weight of sudden advancement, and so the network of watchers revealed themselves in stages, ensuring that contact amplified unity rather than division. Daniel felt tears trace unnoticed paths down his dust-streaked cheeks as the sphere withdrew, rising gracefully into the air to join its counterparts, and across the globe sensors and human eyes alike recorded the same impossible spectacle, objects accelerating beyond comprehension, yet causing no harm, halting over oceans and deserts and remote regions, as if sketching a planetary perimeter of reassurance. And slowly, astonishingly, the anticipated cascade of missiles and countermeasures did not come, because commanders hesitated, politicians consulted, scientists urged caution, and ordinary people, confronted with something undeniably beyond human origin, responded not with riots, but with a stunned, collective stillness that felt like the intake of a planetary breath. Hours later, as dawn approached and the first pale light touched the desert, the luminous constellation began to ascend, not vanishing abruptly, but accelerating upward in smooth arcs that radar tracked as gentle curves rather than violent spikes, as though the initial impossible speeds had been theatrical flourishes meant to shatter complacency. And, one by one, the objects crossed the threshold of atmosphere, their signatures fading into the vastness beyond, leaving behind skies as empty as they had always appeared yet.